The deposit slip was still damp from the rain when Walter Grady placed it on the polished counter at First Midland Agricultural Bank. $25. Soil-stained bills folded twice beside a handwritten note that listed fertilizer costs in careful blue ink. The teller barely looked at him before sliding the receipt back across the marble. Minimum commercial deposit is $100 now. A few customers laughed softly behind him. One man in a seed company jacket muttered something about museum farmers. Walter nodded once, folded the receipt into his shirt pocket, and walked back into the cold October wind without arguing. What nobody noticed was the old leather notebook tucked beneath his arm. Or the way his grandson, seated quietly near the lobby coffee machine, kept staring at the bank president's framed photograph on the wall beside a faded county development certificate dated 1973. Because 3 days earlier, inside a courthouse basement filled with dust-covered land ledgers, the boy had found a number that should not have existed anymore. And Walter had already understood exactly what it meant. The story opens in late October in rural Iowa. Morning fog sits low over harvested soybean fields while Walter Grady drives an aging Ford pickup toward town with his grandson, Eli. The truck heater barely works. Walter drinks black coffee from a dented thermos while reviewing handwritten numbers in a small leather notebook. The notebook becomes an important recurring object. Walter is 72. Quiet. Methodical. Widowed. He operates a shrinking family farm that barely survives drought cycles and equipment repairs. He never complains openly. Eli, 14 years old, notices details the way Walter does. Their relationship is built on silence more than conversation. During the drive, Eli asks why they still bank with First Midland Agricultural Bank after years of increasing fees. Walter simply says, "Because some places keep records longer than they keep promises." The meaning is unclear. At the bank, the atmosphere feels polished and corporate. New branding covers old rural identity. Younger staff wear expensive watches and speak in rehearsed customer service language. Farmers sit quietly in molded chairs waiting for loan reviews. Walter attempts to deposit $25 from produce sales to keep the farm operating account active. The teller humiliates him publicly after explaining the bank's new, commercial minimum balance compliance policy. Nearby customers quietly laugh. A junior loan officer watches with amusement. Walter never argues. But Eli watches everything. The teller's nervous glance toward management. The framed 1973 County Agricultural Partnership certificate on the wall. The old vault hallway still preserved behind remodeled offices. The bank president avoiding eye contact. Outside, Walter calmly folds the rejected deposit receipt and places it inside the leather notebook beside decades-old receipts and tax records. No anger. No speech. Only silence. That night at the farmhouse, Eli asks why Walter kept old paperwork nobody cares about anymore. Walter answers carefully. Because institutions survive by assuming ordinary people throw things away. That line becomes a thematic anchor. The farmhouse atmosphere is cinematic and restrained. Ticking kitchen clock. Steaming kettle. Rain hitting old windows. Stacks of county maps. Faded crop surveys. Filing boxes labeled by year. Eli learns Walter once attended county zoning meetings in the 1970s during construction of agricultural irrigation routes tied to federal development grants. Walter never fully explains why he stopped attending. The next day, Eli visits the county courthouse basement searching for old plat maps for a school project. The basement clerk recognizes the Grady name and casually mentions that Walter's father once fought a land access dispute involving local banks decades earlier. Curiosity deepens. Inside dusty storage shelves, Eli discovers handwritten county ledgers, infrastructure surveys, agricultural development filings, easement agreements, and one unusual ledger from 1973. Inside the ledger, First Midland Agricultural Cooperative Expansion Program, multiple farm signatures, county-backed irrigation easements, land access compensation schedules, Then Eli notices something strange. Several payment records are marked, deferred perpetual consideration. The phrase appears repeatedly beside Walter's father's property parcel number. Eli doesn't understand the meaning, but the wording feels important. One folded document is missing from the file. Only staple marks remain. Before leaving, Eli photographs the pages quietly. That evening, Walter studies the photos in silence at the kitchen table while coffee grows cold beside him. His expression changes for the first time in the story. Not shock. Recognition. Then he quietly asks, "Did anybody see you copying these?" Eli says no. Walter nods once and retrieves an older box from the back closet. Inside. Cancelled checks. County correspondence. Engineering surveys. Handwritten meeting notes. And an unopened envelope dated August 1974. Walter finally reveals the first major emotional truth. His father believed the bank never completed part of a compensation agreement tied to county irrigation access routes crossing Grady farmland. But nobody could ever prove it. Walter says his father spent years trying to fight the issue before giving up after legal costs buried the farm in debt. Eli asks, "So why keep all this?" Walter slowly opens the sealed 1974 envelope. Inside is a carbon copy letter from a county attorney referencing continuing obligations under cooperative access provisions. The sentence changes everything. Walter leans back quietly while rain taps against the dark kitchen windows. Then he says, "They laughed over $25. Long pause. But they may still owe this farm a great deal more than that." The section ends with Walter opening the leather notebook and writing down the names of 3 current bank executives beneath a heading. 1973 Access Files. 3 mornings after the failed deposit, Walter drove Eli back into town before sunrise. The roads were empty except for milk trucks and grain haulers moving through the fog. Walter kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the leather notebook on the seat beside him. He had barely spoken since opening the 1974 letter. Eli noticed the change. Not excitement. Precision. Walter parked behind a county courthouse instead of near the front entrance. The building sat quiet beneath pale gray skies, its limestone walls stained by decades of winters. A maintenance worker smoked beside the loading dock while unlocking a basement records entrance. Walter carried 2 things. The notebook. And a folded county map wrapped in rubber bands. Nothing else. Inside, the courthouse basement smelled like paper dust, radiator heat, and old cardboard. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Filing shelves stretched through narrow aisles packed with agricultural surveys, probate ledgers, drainage permits, mineral rights maps, and decades of handwritten property records. The records clerk from Eli's previous visit looked surprised. "You're Walter Grady." Walter nodded once. "Haven't seen your family down here in years." Walter answered quietly. "That's usually how people like it." The clerk led them toward archived county development files from the early 70s. Along the way, Eli noticed several storage cabinets labeled Water Access, County Easements, Federal Rural Development, Agricultural Cooperatives. Walter moved carefully through the aisles, not searching randomly. He already knew where certain years should be located. Eli realized his grandfather had likely been here many times before. The hidden intelligence became clearer. Walter was not discovering the past. He was returning to it. At a long wooden table beneath a flickering lamp, Walter spread out the old county map. Red pencil marks crossed several farm parcels surrounding a narrow irrigation corridor built in 1973 during a federally supported agricultural expansion project. The corridor now sat beneath land controlled indirectly by First Midland Agricultural Bank through foreclosure transfers over decades. Walter traced one line carefully. This used to belong to 6 families. Eli looked closer. Only one name remained active on modern records. Grady. Walter then explained something he had never told anyone in full detail. In 1973, the county approved a cooperative irrigation route through private farmland to qualify for federal agricultural development funding. Local farmers agreed to partial land access under a compensation structure managed through the bank. But the agreement contained unusual language. Perpetual maintenance obligations, conditional revenue participation, and continuing access compensation tied to commercial use expansion. At the time, most farmers trusted the bank. Nobody expected corporate restructuring decades later. Walter's father had suspected the bank quietly dissolved portions of the payment structure after several farms failed during the recession years of the early 1980s. But proving it became impossible once records disappeared. Until now. Eli asked the obvious question. If the agreement still exists, why hasn't anyone said anything? Walter looked toward the shelves. Because most people who signed it are dead. Silence settled heavily over the room. Then came the first procedural reveal. Inside an annex folder attached to the 1973 ledger, Eli discovered a cross-reference number connected to a missing engineering survey. The survey referenced commercial agricultural utility conversion rights. Walter immediately froze. That phrase mattered a great deal. He quietly asked the clerk whether old utility conversion filings were stored separately from land agreements. The clerk hesitated. Sometimes. Depends who requested classification. Bank lawyers. The clerk didn't answer directly. Instead, he disappeared into another archive room and returned 15 minutes later carrying 3 oversized binders wrapped with county storage tape. One binder still carried a faded legal tag from 1986. Restricted review, pending claims. Walter stared at it for a long moment before opening it carefully. Inside. Engineering route diagrams. Internal county memos. Unsigned settlement drafts. And several handwritten notes referencing deferred liabilities tied to future commercial development. Then Eli found a line that changed the entire investigation. Obligations remain attached to successor commercial beneficiaries unless formally extinguished by compensation release. Walter read it twice. Slowly. Carefully. The bank never obtained a compensation release. Which meant the obligation may have survived every merger, foreclosure, restructuring, and ownership transfer for over 50 years. Eli finally understood why Walter stayed calm at the bank. The deposit humiliation no longer looked personal. It looked accidental. Like the bank had stepped directly onto buried ground it never realized still existed. But the next discovery made things worse. Attached to the engineering file sat a list of participating farms and projected commercial utility values based on future expansion near the irrigation corridor. One parcel now contained grain storage facilities, leased processing infrastructure, and commercial distribution access currently generating millions annually through bank-controlled subsidiaries. Walter quietly calculated numbers in the notebook while Eli watched. No dramatic reaction. Only arithmetic. Then Walter closed the binder. We need copies of everything. The clerk looked uneasy. Some of these files were never digitized. Walter replied. That's probably why they survived. As copies printed slowly in the back office, Eli noticed a man upstairs through the basement stairwell window speaking urgently with courthouse staff while glancing repeatedly downward. Dark suit. Expensive coat. Bank employee. Someone already knew they were here. Walter saw him too but showed no reaction. Instead, he calmly organized every copied document into labeled folders using handwritten tabs. Access. Liability. Successor clauses. Utility rights. Unresolved filings. The preparation felt methodical. Almost practiced. Outside the courthouse, cold wind swept across the parking lot while Walter loaded boxes into the truck bed beneath an old canvas tarp. Eli finally asked. What happens if you're right? Walter stared across town toward the distant First Midland Bank building standing above the grain elevator. Then he answered quietly. If those agreements survived. Long pause. They built their expansion on unpaid ground. The section ends with a final reveal. Back at the farmhouse that night, Walter opens the leather notebook to an older page Eli has never seen before. At the top is a handwritten sentence dated 1987. Do not force them to notice until they are too large to deny. Underneath it sits a list of bank merger dates spanning 4 decades. Walter had been tracking them the entire time. The first snowfall came early that year. Thin ice crusted the fence lines around the Grady farm while Walter spent most mornings at the kitchen table surrounded by folders, maps, and legal pads. The old tea kettle whistled every hour. Coffee rings darkened the edges of county copies spread beneath a yellow reading lamp. Eli watched his grandfather work without rushing. No dramatic phone calls. No threats. No celebration. Only organization. Walter built timelines across long sheets of graph paper. 1973 irrigation agreements. 1978 commercial utility amendments. 1982 foreclosure acquisitions. 1987 bank restructuring. 1999 regional merger expansion. 2008 subsidiary consolidations. Lines connected everything. The deeper Eli looked, the clearer the pattern became. Every version of the bank inherited the land benefits. None appeared to formally close the original obligations. At school, Eli secretly used library computers to search old newspaper archives. Most articles praised First Midland Agricultural Bank for modernizing rural commerce and revitalizing struggling farmland economies. But buried inside a 1987 regional business article, Eli found one sentence mentioning unresolved infrastructure liabilities connected to legacy agricultural partnerships. No details followed. Still, the phrase matched Walter's notebook. That evening, Eli slid the newspaper printout across the kitchen table. Walter studied it silently before giving the smallest nod Eli had ever seen from him. Good. Not praise. Recognition. The emotional restraint made the moment feel heavier. Walter finally decided they needed outside confirmation. Not a lawsuit yet. Just interpretation. He drove 2 counties over to visit an elderly semi-retired attorney named Raymond Tully, who had once specialized in agricultural land disputes during the 1970s. His office sat above a hardware store beside an abandoned railway depot. The waiting room smelled like dust, pipe tobacco, and old books. Tully himself looked nearly as old as the building. Suspenders. Thick glasses. Yellow legal pads stacked everywhere. Filing cabinets with handwritten labels. When Walter placed the copied agreements on the desk, Tully stopped halfway through pouring coffee. You kept these? Walter answered simply. My father did. For nearly an hour, the attorney read in silence while snow tapped softly against the office windows. Eli watched Tully's expression slowly shift from polite curiosity to visible concern. Finally, the old attorney leaned back heavily. This isn't dead paperwork. No one spoke. Tully pointed toward one paragraph buried deep inside the 1973 Cooperative Expansion Agreement. A successor liability clause. The language was narrow but dangerous. Any institution benefiting commercially from the converted irrigation infrastructure inherited continuing compensation obligations unless formally released by all participating landholders. Walter asked the question carefully. Could it still apply? Tully removed his glasses. If no release exists, yes. Then came the complication. The damages themselves might not be enormous by corporate standards if viewed narrowly. But if decades of commercial utility profits, easement conversions, and successor benefit calculations were examined together, the exposure could become catastrophic publicly. Especially if regulators became involved. Especially if other farms once tied to the corridor resurfaced. Especially if internal suppression of obligations could be proven. Tully looked directly at Walter. You understand what this means? Walter nodded once. They never expected anyone to keep records. The attorney became quiet. Then he asked the question Eli had silently wondered since the courthouse discovery. How long have you suspected this? Walter stared toward the snowy street outside. Since 1987. Even Eli felt stunned. Walter explained calmly. During the 1980s banking collapse, his father noticed foreclosure transfers were absorbing infrastructure access rights without renewing compensation filings. Walter began tracking mergers afterward, believing the liability chain remained alive if the bank ever expanded the commercial corridor enough to increase valuation significantly. But the family lacked evidence. Until Eli found the ledger. The trap had not been created recently. It had been waiting for decades. Tully warned them not to move recklessly. If the bank sensed exposure, internal legal teams could bury records, pressure county officials, or attempt confidential settlements before broader review occurred. Walter replied quietly. They already underestimated us once. On the drive home, Eli finally understood the emotional core beneath Walter's calm. This was never about revenge alone. It was about his father dying convinced ordinary people could never outlast institutions. Walter intended to prove otherwise. 2 days later, the first sign of corporate awareness arrived. A black SUV appeared near the Grady property entrance just after dawn. It remained parked beside the road for 20 minutes before leaving. No one approached the house. That afternoon, the county clerk called Walter personally. Her voice sounded nervous. She mentioned that representatives from First Midland had suddenly requested archived irrigation records from the 1970s for digitization purposes. Walter thanked her politely and hung up. Then he immediately drove to town. Not to confront the bank. To secure certified copies. Inside the courthouse basement, Walter moved with quiet urgency. Eli helped organize folders while the clerk stamped records individually. Certified land access agreements. Commercial conversion surveys. Maintenance obligations. Successor liability references. Walter paid cash for every copy. Before leaving, he requested one additional file, the original 1974 County Attorney Correspondence Registry. The clerk hesitated. That file hasn't been opened in years. Walter answered. That's why I'd like to see it. Inside the registry sat confirmation that the missing compensation release form had never been filed. Not delayed. Never filed. The silence afterward felt enormous. Even the clerk looked unsettled now. Back at the farmhouse, Walter placed the certified documents into weatherproof binders while Eli updated timelines across the dining room wall using pushpins and string. Outside, snow drifted quietly across empty fields. Inside, the case became real. Then the phone rang. Walter answered calmly. A polished corporate voice introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, Senior Regional Compliance Director for First Midland Agricultural Bank. Mercer said the bank wished to clarify historical administrative misunderstandings. Walter listened without interruption. Mercer offered to send representatives to discuss possible goodwill resolutions. Walter replied with only one sentence. You laughed at $25. Then he hung up. The section ends later that night. Eli wakes near midnight and walks into the kitchen. Walter sits alone beneath the reading lamp reviewing the original deposit slip from the day of the humiliation. Beside it rests the certified successor liability documents. 2 pieces of paper. One worth $25. The other potentially worth millions. Walter quietly places them side by side inside the leather notebook. Then closes it. The next morning arrived without snow. Only a low gray sky pressing over frozen fields. Walter did not go to the courthouse. He did not go to town. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with the leather notebook open, reviewing every copied document line by line as if rereading a language only he fully understood. Eli noticed something new. Walter was no longer searching. He was anticipating. A pencil rested beside him, marking patterns in margins. Repeated bank merger references. Overlapping utility corridors. Timing gaps in compensation filings. and unexplained administrative delays between county approvals and bank acquisitions. Each mark tightened the shape of something larger. A structure. Not a mistake. A system. By mid-morning, the first subtle escalation appeared. A county maintenance truck stopped near the Grady property fence line. Two men stepped out, pretending to inspect irrigation markers that had not been touched in years. One of them took photographs of the land boundary stakes. Eli watched from the barn doorway. Walter did not react. He simply wrote in a notebook. Observation phase. That same afternoon, Eli returned from school early after the principal called Walter about external inquiries regarding student attendance records. The wording felt unusual. Not disciplinary. Investigative. Walter listened silently. Then thanked them. Nothing more. But that night, he placed a second phone on the kitchen table. A prepaid device he had never mentioned before. Eli stared at it. Walter said only, "Use it if anyone asks questions about me." The simplicity made it more serious. The following day, the pressure shifted again. A man arrived at the courthouse requesting expedited access to archived agricultural cooperative files. He presented credentials from First Midland Agricultural Bank's Legal Compliance Division. His tone was polite, professional, controlled. But the clerk later told Eli something unusual. He asked specifically for successor liability documentation, irrigation corridor compensation records, and any unresolved legacy obligations tied to the 1973 expansion project. The exact phrasing matched Walter's files. That evening, Walter reviewed the same information from a different angle. He no longer focused on what the bank had. He focused on what they were looking for. That distinction changed everything. Meanwhile, Eli noticed something disturbing in the town itself. A quiet shift. The grain elevator manager suddenly asked about the Grady Farms water access rights. A neighboring farmer mentioned receiving a routine infrastructure audit notice. Even the hardware store owner commented that someone from the bank had been asking about old county irrigation easements. None of it was direct. But all of it converged. Walter labeled it in the notebook. Soft containment inquiry. He explained nothing to Eli. But Eli understood the pattern instinctively. The bank was not attacking yet. It was mapping. Trying to determine how deep the problem went before deciding how to respond. That night, Walter drove alone into town. He parked 2 blocks from First Midland Agricultural Bank and sat inside the truck for 27 minutes without moving. Eli later learned this was not hesitation. It was observation. Inside the bank lobby, security had changed subtly. Additional cameras near document counters. Restricted access to archival filing rooms. 2 new legal consultants speaking quietly with branch management. And a visible shift in staff behavior. No one looked relaxed. Walter returned home without entering the building. He placed a single note on the table. They know something is wrong. They do not know what yet. The next escalation arrived in a sealed envelope delivered by courier. No return address. Only the bank logo embossed in silver. Inside, a request for historical clarification meeting regarding agricultural cooperative easement records. The language was careful. Non-threatening. Almost polite. But the structure revealed intent. Voluntary participation. Confidentiality clause. Early settlement discussion framing. And a vague reference to potential administrative reconciliation. Walter read it once. Then again. Eli asked what it meant. Walter replied. It means they are trying to decide the cost of silence. The emotional temperature in the house changed after that. Not fear. Wait. That evening, Walter opened a new folder labeled Settlement Phase Indicators. Inside he placed the courier letter, county clerk statements, surveillance observations, and Eli's printed newspaper archive. He added a final page. First contact initiated without legal demand. Then something unexpected happened. Walter smiled faintly. Not because he was pleased. Because confirmation had arrived exactly as he expected. He turned to Eli. "They're early?" Eli asked. "Is that good?" Walter shook his head slowly. "It means we were right sooner than they planned for." The next morning, a black SUV returned. This time it parked directly across from the farmhouse entrance. No one exited. No one moved. It simply waited. Walter observed it for 10 minutes from the kitchen window before speaking. "They're deciding whether to escalate or negotiate." Eli asked what he would do. Walter closed the notebook. "Neither." A pause. "Let them choose first." The section ends with Walter retrieving an old county survey map and marking a single circle around the irrigation corridor intersection. Then, in quiet ink beneath it, he writes. "Value has been accruing since 1973. The black SUV did not leave that time. It simply repositioned itself twice during the day, like a presence testing boundaries rather than making contact." Walter noticed everything. The angle of parking. The timing of engine idling. The way the driver avoided eye contact when stepping out briefly to smoke. Eli called it surveillance. Walter called it measurement. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere had shifted again. Not louder. Not more urgent. Just heavier, like pressure building under glass. Walter continued organizing documents with the same pace as before. Copying county files. Cross-checking merger timelines. Verifying easement continuity. Annotating compensation gaps. But now every page had a second layer of purpose. Preparation for scrutiny. By midweek, the first formal escalation arrived. A bank liaison visited the county courthouse under the title, Regional Historical Records Coordinator. He requested full access to restricted agricultural infrastructure archives tied to the 1973 irrigation expansion. The request was not denied. But it was delayed. That delay mattered. Because it meant legal review had already begun behind closed doors. Eli noticed the clerk's behavior change. She no longer spoke casually. She checked approvals twice before releasing anything. And she avoided Walter's name when speaking to others. The town had begun to recognize a shift in gravity. That evening, Walter received a second communication from First Midland Agricultural Bank. This time, it was not a letter. It was a formal, pre-litigation resolution proposal. Eli read it silently beside him. The language was carefully neutral. Good faith historical clarification. Mutual administrative adjustment. Voluntary compensation review. Confidential settlement discussion. But beneath the phrasing was something unmistakable. Fear. Not emotional fear. Institutional caution. Walter placed the document on the table and did not speak for a long time. Eli finally asked. "Is this the settlement?" Walter shook his head. "No." He tapped one line. "This is them testing how much we already know." That night, Walter added a new section to the notebook. Bank Response Phase 1, Indirect Value Estimation. Under it. Courier Letter. SUV Observation Logs. Courthouse Access Attempts. Settlement Language Drafts. He began mapping their behavior the same way he had mapped the land. Then something unexpected happened. A phone call came through the prepaid device Walter had given Eli. Eli answered. A calm professional voice introduced herself as a legal consultant working with First Midland Agricultural Bank's Compliance Division. She asked if Walter would be willing to review preliminary historical reconciliation figures. Eli stayed silent. The woman continued. She referenced approximate valuation ranges tied to legacy agricultural infrastructure utilization rights. The numbers she mentioned were not precise. But they were large enough to change tone. Eli wrote them down and handed the note to Walter. For the first time, Walter exhaled slightly longer than usual. Not surprise. Confirmation of scale. He said quietly. They finally ran internal calculations. That evening, Walter opened a sealed envelope from 1989 that Eli had never seen before. Inside were handwritten notes from Walter's father referencing unpaid corridor yield adjustments and a warning. Do not accept early settlement. They will test for ignorance first. Eli looked at him. You've known this was coming the whole time. Walter did not answer immediately. He folded the paper carefully. I knew they would eventually notice. A pause. I didn't know when. The next morning, the escalation became visible again. 2 legal representatives from the bank arrived at the county courthouse together. They did not request records this time. They requested a meeting. Private. With Walter Grady. The clerk called Walter immediately. Her voice was lower now. Careful. They're asking for you specifically. Walter closed the notebook. No meeting yet. Eli looked up sharply. Why not? Walter stood slowly. Because they're still guessing. That answer carried weight. By afternoon, the bank representatives had moved their request directly to Walter through a certified notice. The document framed the situation as preliminary valuation discrepancy requiring cooperative clarification to avoid escalation into formal dispute channels. Eli read it twice. Then asked. What happens if you ignore them? Walter looked out toward the fields. Then they escalate. A pause. And we find out how much they're willing to risk being wrong. Later that day, the SUV returned again. This time it did not park near the road. It stopped closer to the farmhouse entrance than before. Still no one exited. But this time, the engine remained off. Silence. Controlled presence. Eli felt it more than saw it. Walter stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Then he spoke. They've moved from observation to positioning. Eli asked. What does that mean? Walter replied quietly. It means they believe there is something real here. He turned back to the table and opened a fresh page in the notebook. At the top, he wrote. Phase 2, indirect negotiation pressure. Under it. Settlement inquiries increasing. Legal access requests expanding. Internal valuation estimates emerging. Field observation confirmed. Then one final line. They are preparing to pay for silence or fight for ignorance. Walter closed the notebook. And for the first time since the humiliation at the bank, he said something that sounded almost final. Either way, they have already admitted the past is still alive. The section ends with Eli watching the SUV from the window as dusk settles over the farm. Neither of them moves. But everything has shifted. Inside the farmhouse, nothing felt resolved yet. Only inevitable. Walter spent the morning alone with the leather notebook open in front of him, but he was no longer adding anything new. The pages were already full of timelines, annotations, and cross-referenced county codes. Now he was waiting. Eli noticed the change first. The urgency was gone. Not because the threat disappeared. Because it had been fully mapped. At noon, a sealed courier arrived. No SUV this time. No surveillance visible from the road. Just a single envelope delivered with formal precision. The return address read. First Midland Agricultural Bank, Legal Affairs Division. Walter opened it without hesitation. Inside was a document titled Preliminary Findings of Historical Infrastructure Compensation Review, Confidential Draft. Eli read over his shoulder. The language was no longer cautious. It was restrained alarm. The bank's internal audit acknowledged. The 1973 Irrigation Corridor Agreement existed in enforceable archival form. Successor liability language had not been extinguished. Compensation release documentation could not be located in any verified record system. And commercial benefit continuation appeared, material and ongoing across multiple corporate restructuring events. Then came the critical line. Potential exposure requires immediate confidential resolution assessment to mitigate regulatory and reputational escalation risk. Eli looked up slowly. This means they believe it's real. Walter nodded once. Yes. But his expression did not change. No satisfaction. No relief. Only completion of expectation. That afternoon, 2 senior representatives arrived at the farmhouse. No longer observers. No longer negotiators by proxy. Actual decision-makers. They did not park far away. They walked directly to the door. Walter met them at the porch without inviting them in. The first man spoke carefully. Professional tone. Controlled posture. We would like to discuss an administrative resolution regarding historical agricultural infrastructure obligations tied to the Grady parcel. Walter listened. He did not interrupt. The second man added. The bank is prepared to offer compensation reflecting good faith acknowledgement of legacy discrepancies. Eli stood slightly behind Walter, watching every detail. Walter finally spoke. One question. They nodded. Walter asked. Have you found the missing release? A pause. The men exchanged a glance. No. That was the first crack. Walter continued quietly. Then you're not resolving anything. Silence settled across the porch. Wind moved through the fields behind them. The second man lowered his voice. We are trying to avoid escalation. Walter replied. You are already in it. That sentence changed the tone completely. Not aggressive. Final. Inside the farmhouse later, the representatives reviewed their position again by phone. Eli overheard fragments through the wall. Confirmed archival continuity, cannot dismiss successor clause risk, regulatory exposure if this becomes public, settlement range may need expansion. The word expansion hung in the air longer than the rest. When they left, the farm felt quieter than before. Not peaceful. Finished. That evening, Walter placed every document into a single steel storage box. Eli asked. Is it over? Walter did not answer immediately. He closed the lid. Not over. A pause. Decided. The next morning, a final envelope arrived. This one contained a settlement agreement draft. It was precise, structured, and heavily confidential. Multi-parcel compensation framework. Historical acknowledgement clause. Non-disclosure agreement. Phased payment schedule tied to agricultural corridor valuation. The numbers were not spoken aloud. But Eli saw Walter's eyes move across them once. Then stop. Walter signed nothing. He simply placed the document beside the original 1973 county ledger copy on the table. 2 artifacts. One created by expectation. One created by record. Then he called the bank representative. Only one sentence was spoken. No settlement without public correction of record. The call ended. That was the true breaking point. 2 days later, the county clerk called. Her voice was calm but careful. The bank has requested formal amendment filing procedures for historical agricultural easement records. Walter responded. Let them. Because now it was no longer negotiation. It was documentation correction under institutional pressure. By the end of the week, the county archives confirmed something quietly significant. The 1973 ledger entry had been reactivated for legal review tracking. A record that had sat dormant for decades was now officially active dispute status. That phrase meant everything. Walter finally took Eli outside that evening. The field stretched wide and silent. The same land that had been questioned, measured, and underestimated for half a century. Walter spoke softly. My father thought this would disappear. Eli asked. But it didn't. Walter shook his head. No. A long pause. It just waited for someone patient enough to read it properly. The wind moved across the empty rows of soil. No SUV. No courthouse meetings. No letters. Only the land. And the record. Walter placed the leather notebook into Eli's hands for the first time. Keep it. Eli hesitated. Walter added. You understand it now. Eli held it carefully. Inside, the final page was already written. Not by anger. By patience. The bank did not lose this case when it was filed. It lost it when it forgot it was still open. The story ends not with confrontation, but with correction. And a quiet farm that no longer looked small in the way it once did.